The warm oils dripped down my back as her gentle hands worked away 3 decades of stress. I should have known then that some touches cost more than money. They cost your soul. But when you're 57, divorced, and drowning in loneliness, you don't ask questions about miracles. You just close your eyes and let them happen. My name is David, and this is the story of how I fell in love with my masseuse, only to discover she had fallen in love with my wallet. It's a story about trust, manipulation, and the dangerous territory between healing and heartbreak. If you've ever wondered how smart people make stupid decisions, stick around. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel, because stories like these need to be told. The divorce papers had been signed for 8 months when I first walked into Lotus Spa in downtown Seattle. Rebecca had taken half of everything, including my confidence, but thankfully not my consulting business. At 57, I found myself in that strange liminal space that middle-aged men occupy after their world falls apart. Too old to start over, too young to give up. The house felt cavernous without her laughter echoing through the rooms, and the silence had become a living thing that followed me from room to room. I'd thrown myself into work with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. 18-hour days became my norm. My shoulders carried the weight of server migrations and database optimizations like Atlas carrying the world. The stress had crystallized in my muscles, turning my back into a roadmap of knots and tension. My doctor had been blunt during my last physical. David, you're going to have a heart attack or a nervous breakdown if you don't find a way to decompress. Consider massage therapy. The prescription pad might as well have been written in a foreign language. I'd never been the spa type. Rebecca had been the one who believed in aromatherapy and meditation retreats. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The Lotus Spa sat nestled between a Vietnamese restaurant and an antique bookshop on Pine Street. The exterior was understated, almost secretive, with frosted windows that revealed nothing of the world within. A small brass placard by the door simply read, "Lotus Spa, authentic Thai massage." I hesitated on the threshold, feeling ridiculous. A middle-aged technology consultant seeking refuge in essential oils and new age music. But my shoulders screamed in protest as I reached for the door handle, and that pain pushed me forward. The interior was a revelation. Soft lighting cast everything in warm amber tones. The air was thick with sandalwood and something else I couldn't identify. Something that seemed to reach directly into my nervous system and whisper, "Relax." Traditional Thai music played softly from hidden speakers, the kind of music that sounds like water flowing over stones. Behind the reception desk sat a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, with the kind of delicate beauty that belongs in Renaissance paintings. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and when she looked up at me, her eyes held depths I couldn't fathom. "Welcome to Lotus Spa," she said, and her voice carried the faintest trace of an accent that made every word sound like a secret. "I am Siripon, but you can call me Siri. How can I help you today?" There was something in the way she said my name after I introduced myself that made it sound new, like she was the first person to ever truly pronounce it correctly. She explained the different types of massage they offered with the patience of someone who genuinely cared about healing. When she recommended the deep tissue massage, her fingers briefly touched my arm, and I felt electricity run through my entire body. That first session was pure magic. Siri's hands seemed to know exactly where every knot of tension lived in my body. She worked with a combination of strength and gentleness that I'd never experienced. As she worked, she talked softly about pressure points and energy flow, about how the body holds on to emotional pain in physical ways. Your shoulders, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They carry so much sadness. We will work together to release this, yes? There was something about the way she said, we, that made my heart skip. Not, I will work on you, but we will work together. Partnership, collaboration. After 8 months of doing everything alone, that word felt like sunlight after an endless winter. The transformation was immediate. I slept better that night than I had in months. My shoulders felt loose, free. But more than that, I felt seen, understood. Siri had looked at my body and read the story of my pain like a book written in muscle and sinew. I made another appointment before I left, telling myself it was purely therapeutic. But I knew I was lying even as the words left my mouth. That second appointment, she remembered details about my life that I'd mentioned in passing during the first session. How my consulting business was growing, but how the stress was overwhelming. How quiet my house felt now that I lived alone. How I'd been married for 26 years before it all fell apart. She listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like the most important person in the world. During the massage, she shared small details about her own life. How she'd come from Thailand 5 years ago to study alternative medicine. How she sent money back to her family in Chiang Mai every month. How she dreamed of opening her own wellness center someday. The third appointment became a weekly ritual. Then twice weekly, the massage table became a confessional, where I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone. My fears about aging alone, my guilt about the divorce, my worry that I'd wasted the best years of my life climbing a corporate ladder that led nowhere meaningful. Siri absorbed it all with the grace of someone who had been trained not just in the healing of bodies, but in the tending of souls. The first warning sign should have been the money. During our fourth session, Siri mentioned almost casually that she was behind on her rent. The spa owner, she explained, took 70% of what clients paid, leaving her with barely enough to survive. I love the work, she said, her hands working magic on my lower back. But sometimes, I wonder if I made a mistake coming to America. Everything is so expensive here. The vulnerability in her voice broke something open in my chest. Here was this beautiful, talented woman who was struggling financially while providing healing to people like me. It seemed profoundly unfair. That night, I lay awake thinking about her situation. I had money. More money than I knew what to do with, honestly. The divorce settlement had been painful, but my consulting business was thriving. I was charging major corporations 6 figures for digital transformations that I could design in my sleep. What was $1,000 to me? Nothing. What was it to her? Rent, food, security, the ability to continue doing the work she loved. The next session, I brought it up as casually as I could manage. You know, I was thinking about what you said last week about the rent situation. I hate the idea of you struggling when you're so talented at what you do. Would it help if I covered the shortfall this month? Just until you get back on your feet. The silence that followed felt eternal. I worried I had overstepped, that I had made everything weird and inappropriate. But then she turned around, and there were tears in her eyes. David, she whispered, you would do that for me? The gratitude in her voice was overwhelming. She hugged me then. A brief, innocent embrace that nonetheless sent shockwaves through my entire being. You are so kind, so generous. I don't know how to thank you. I told her that helping her was thanks enough, that seeing her succeed was all the gratitude I needed, and in that moment, I meant every word. The money became a regular thing, not just rent, but other expenses that seemed to crop up with increasing frequency. Her grandmother in Thailand needed surgery. Her student visa required expensive renewals. The spa was cutting her hours because business was slow. Each request came with tears, with genuine distress, with promises to pay me back as soon as her situation improved. And each time, I found myself reaching for my checkbook without hesitation. The money meant nothing to me, but her relief and gratitude meant everything. Our relationship began to evolve in ways that felt natural, but were probably anything but. She started staying after her shift to talk with me. Sometimes for hours, we'd sit in the dimly lit spa, sharing stories about our childhoods, our dreams, our fears. She told me about growing up in rural Thailand, about the poverty that had driven her to seek a better life in America. I told her about building my business from nothing, about the loneliness of success, about how empty achievement felt when there was no one to share it with. The physical boundary between therapist and client began to blur. Her touches lingered longer than they needed to. She'd rest her hand on my shoulder while we talked, or brush my arm while making a point. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed any obvious lines, but enough to make my heart race and my mind wander into dangerous territory. I started looking forward to our sessions with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. She became the brightest part of my week, sometimes the only bright part. 6 months into our arrangement, she suggested we meet outside the spa. "There's a Thai restaurant I love," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "The owner is from my hometown. I'd love to share some real Thai food with you, show you the flavors of my country." The restaurant was small and authentic, the kind of place where half the menu was in Thai, and the other half was almost incomprehensible English. Siri ordered for both of us, translating each dish, watching my face carefully as I tasted flavors I'd never experienced before. That dinner felt like a first date, even though I knew it wasn't. We talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they're falling in love, but neither one wants to admit it. She told me stories about her childhood that made me laugh until my sides hurt. I shared memories of my early days as an entrepreneur, the failures and small victories that had shaped my career. The evening flew by like minutes. When I dropped her off at her apartment building, she kissed my cheek and thanked me for the most wonderful evening I've had since coming to America. I drove home in a daze, my cheek still burning from her kiss. I was 57 years old, successful, educated, experienced in the ways of the world. But I felt like a teenager with his first crush. I told myself it was just friendship, just gratitude, just two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. But my heart knew better. I was falling in love with Siripon, and every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings that I chose to ignore. The money requests became more frequent and more substantial. Her visa status was in jeopardy, she explained, and she needed to hire an immigration lawyer. $5,000. Her family's farm in Thailand was facing foreclosure, and she was the only one who could help. $10,000. The spa was planning to let her go unless she could pay for additional certifications. $3,000. Each crisis seemed urgent, legitimate, heart-wrenching, and each time I found myself writing checks without question. Our relationship became more intimate in small increments. She started calling me late at night when she couldn't sleep, her voice soft and vulnerable in the darkness. "David, are you awake?" I had a nightmare about being sent back to Thailand. We'd talk for hours, me reassuring her that I wouldn't let that happen, that we'd figure everything out together. She began referring to me as her guardian angel, her savior, her dearest friend. The words were innocent enough, but they carried emotional weight that made my chest tight with something between joy and desperation. She started asking for my advice on everything. What should she wear to her visa interview? Which apartment should she choose when her lease was up? Should she take a part-time job at another spa to make extra money? I found myself becoming involved in every aspect of her life, offering opinions and solutions with the enthusiasm of someone who finally felt needed again. She made me feel indispensable, irreplaceable, important in a way I hadn't felt since the early days of my marriage. The turning point came 8 months into our relationship, when she showed up at one of our sessions, visibly upset. Her eyes were red from crying, and her usual composure was completely shattered. "David," she sobbed, "I don't know what to do. My immigration lawyer says there might be a way to secure my status, but it requires a significant investment. A business partnership with an American citizen. It would cost $50,000, but it would guarantee I could stay in the country legally." $50,000. The number hung in the air between us like a challenge. It was more money than I'd ever given anyone at one time, but it wasn't an amount that would bankrupt me. And the alternative, she explained through her tears, was deportation back to Thailand within 6 months. The thought of losing her, of this bright spot in my life disappearing forever, was unbearable. "I would understand if you can't help," she whispered. "You've already done so much for me. But I had to ask because you're the only person I trust, the only person who cares about what happens to me." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my empty house, weighing the decision from every angle. $50,000 to keep someone I cared about in the country. $50,000 to maintain a relationship that had become the center of my world. When I looked at it that way, it seemed like the bargain of a lifetime. I wrote the check the next morning and hand-delivered it to her apartment. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. She wept with relief, clutching the check to her chest like it was a winning lottery ticket. "David, you've saved my life," she said, hugging me with an intensity that took my breath away. "I will never forget this. Never. You are the most wonderful man I have ever known." For a moment, holding her in my arms while she cried tears of gratitude, I felt like the hero of my own story. I had rescued the damsel in distress. I had solved an impossible problem with my resources and my caring. I was needed, wanted, appreciated in a way that made every dollar worth it. But if you've been following stories like this, you probably know what's coming next. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do, because we cover these kinds of human interest stories regularly. Also, leave a comment below and tell us, have you or someone you know ever fallen into a similar situation? How did it turn out? Your experiences might help others who are going through something similar. The first crack in my perfect fantasy appeared 2 weeks later when I was having lunch at that same Thai restaurant where Siri and I had shared our first dinner outside the spa. I was waiting for her to arrive when I heard familiar laughter from across the room. There she was, sitting at a corner table with a man I'd never seen before. They were holding hands across the table, and she was laughing at something he'd said with the same musical laugh that had charmed me from our very first meeting. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. She was supposed to be at the spa, working her afternoon shift. But here she was, on what looked very much like a romantic lunch date with another man. I sat frozen in my booth, watching them interact with the easy intimacy of a couple. He was younger than me, probably in his 40s, with the kind of rugged good looks that suggested he spent his free time hiking mountains or surfing waves. Everything I wasn't and would never be again. When they got up to leave, he paid the check with a credit card, and she kissed him goodbye. Not the innocent peck on the cheek she'd given me, but a real kiss. A lover's kiss. I waited until they were gone before approaching the waitress who had served them. That couple that just left, I said as casually as I could manage. The Thai woman. Does she come here often? The waitress smiled knowingly. Siri? Oh yes, she comes here all the time with her boyfriend Mike. Such a sweet couple. They've been together for over a year now. Over a year. The words echoed in my head as I drove home in a daze. Our entire relationship. Every intimate conversation. Every grateful hug. Every tear-filled request for money had been happening while she was in a committed relationship with someone else. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach by someone I trusted completely. The betrayal was so profound that I had trouble breathing. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. If Siri was lying about having a boyfriend, what else was she lying about? The investigator was a former police detective named Janet, who specialized in financial fraud cases. She listened to my story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard variations of it many times before. I'm sorry to tell you this, she said, but what you're describing sounds like a classic romance scam. They're becoming increasingly common, especially targeting recently divorced or widowed men with substantial assets. The investigation took 10 days. 10 days during which I continued our regular appointments, continued our long phone conversations, continued pretending that everything was normal while my world crumbled around the edges. Janet's report was devastating in its thoroughness. Siri wasn't just in a relationship with Mike. She was engaged to him. They'd been living together for 18 months in an apartment that I had been unknowingly helping to pay for. The immigration crisis was fabricated. Her visa was perfectly valid and wouldn't expire for another 2 years. The business investment I'd funded didn't exist. The $50,000 had gone into a joint savings account that she shared with her fiancé. Janet had photographs of them house hunting in the suburbs, looking at properties in the $300,000 range. My money was funding their American dream while I lived alone in my empty house, believing I was helping someone I cared about. But the cruelest discovery was that I wasn't her only benefactor. Janet had identified at least 3 other men who were providing regular financial support to Siri. There was Robert, a retired doctor, who was paying for her medical school applications. There was Thomas, a widower, who was funding her family emergencies in Thailand. And there was Kevin, a divorced executive who was covering her spa training expenses. We were all middle-aged, all recently out of long-term relationships, all financially comfortable, and all completely convinced that we were special, that our relationship with her was unique and genuine. The pattern was always the same. Siri would identify lonely, successful men who were seeking healing and human connection. She'd provide both in carefully measured doses, creating emotional dependence while maintaining professional boundaries that made the relationship feel pure and innocent. The financial requests would start small and increase gradually, each one tied to a crisis that tugged at the heartstrings and made refusal seem cruel and heartless. Janet estimated that Siri was collecting between $15,000 and $20,000 per month from her various benefactors. It was a sophisticated operation that required careful scheduling, emotional manipulation, and the ability to make each mark feel like the most important person in her world. "She's very good at what she does," Janet said with professional admiration. "I've seen a lot of these cases, and most of them are much more obvious. Your Siri has real talent." Armed with this information, I faced a choice that would define not just the immediate future, but my entire sense of self-worth and personal integrity. I could confront her directly, lay out the evidence, and demand explanations that we both knew she couldn't provide. I could disappear quietly, simply stop returning her calls, and avoid the spa until she got the message. Or I could play along and try to turn the tables, to manipulate the manipulator and get some kind of justice for myself and the other men she was deceiving. The confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon, during what turned out to be our last appointment together. I had planned to be calm, rational, and controlled. I had practiced what I wanted to say, rehearsed the key points I needed to make. But when I walked into that familiar massage room and saw her preparing the oils with the same gentle care she'd always shown, something inside me snapped. "I know about Mike," I said without preamble. The bottle of massage oil slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, filling the air with the scent of eucalyptus and lies. For a moment, her composure cracked completely, and I saw fear flicker across her features. But she recovered quickly, too quickly for someone who was genuinely surprised. "David," she said, her voice taking on the soothing tone she'd always used when I was upset about something. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Let me explain." But I was beyond explanations. I told her everything I knew about the investigation, about the other men, about the joint savings account, and the house hunting, and the elaborate fiction she'd constructed around our relationship. With each revelation, she tried a different approach. First, denial. "These are lies, David. Someone is trying to hurt me, to turn you against me." Then partial admission. "Yes, Mike and I have been seeing each other, but it's not serious. It's nothing compared to what you and I have." Then full manipulation. "I was going to tell you about him, but I was afraid of losing you. You mean everything to me, David. You're the only one who truly understands me." But the most chilling moment came when she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. The mask dropped completely, and I saw the person underneath. Cold, calculating, professional. "Look, David," she said, sitting down across from me with her hands folded in her lap. "You got what you paid for. You were lonely, I made you feel special. You were stressed, I helped you relax. You wanted to feel needed, I gave you problems to solve. Everyone got something out of this arrangement." "Arrangement?" The word came out as a croak. "I thought we were friends. I thought you cared about me." She shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "I do care about you in my way. You're a nice man, David. Generous, kind, easy to be around. But you were never anything more than a client with benefits. You paid for a fantasy, and I provided one. The fact that you convinced yourself it was real isn't my problem." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Every smile had been purchased. Every intimate conversation had been a transaction. Every tear, every hug, every moment of apparent vulnerability had been a carefully crafted performance designed to keep the money flowing. I had fallen in love with a character she'd created, a role she'd played, a person who had never actually existed. But Siri wasn't finished. As I stood to leave, she delivered one final twist of the knife. If you're thinking about making trouble for me, she said, her voice still pleasant but carrying an unmistakable edge, you should know that I have recordings of some of our conversations where you talked about being lonely, about wanting more than just massage therapy, about how much our relationship meant to you. It would be very easy to make it sound like you were pressuring me for sexual services, like you were taking advantage of a vulnerable immigrant woman. The implication was clear. If I exposed her scam, she would destroy my reputation. She would paint me as a sexual predator who had exploited his position of financial power to coerce a young woman. In the current climate, such accusations would be devastating to my business and my personal life. Regardless of whether they were true, she had protected herself perfectly, insulated against consequences by turning her victims into co-conspirators. I walked out of Lotus Spa that day feeling like I'd aged 10 years in 2 hours. The betrayal was complete, but more than that, I felt stupid, naive, like a mark in a con game, which is exactly what I'd been. How had I convinced myself that a beautiful 30-year-old woman would be genuinely interested in a lonely 57-year-old consultant? How had I ignored all the obvious red flags in favor of a fantasy that made me feel important? The next few weeks were the darkest period of my adult life, darker even than the divorce, because at least then I'd been the victim of honest failure rather than deliberate deception. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Siri's face, heard her voice, remembered the moments when I'd felt most connected to her. Knowing that those moments had been lies somehow made them more painful, not less. I considered going to the police, but Janet had already explained why that wouldn't work. What Siri had done wasn't technically illegal. She hadn't stolen money or committed fraud in the legal sense. She had simply accepted voluntary gifts from men who chose to give them. The fact that those gifts were obtained through emotional manipulation wasn't a crime. It was just morally reprehensible. The system had no remedies for broken hearts and wounded pride. But something interesting happened during those dark weeks. I started researching romance scams, reading stories from other victims, learning about the psychology behind both the perpetrators and their targets. What I discovered was that I wasn't alone, wasn't stupid, wasn't uniquely gullible. Romance scams were a multi-billion-dollar industry that preyed on fundamental human needs for connection, affection, and purpose. The victims weren't idiots. They were people who had made themselves vulnerable in the pursuit of happiness. The scammers weren't monsters. They were entrepreneurs who had identified a market demand and developed efficient methods to meet it. They provided lonely people with the illusion of romance, connection, and significance. In a world where genuine relationships were increasingly difficult to find and maintain, they were selling a product that people desperately wanted to buy. The fact that the product was fake didn't make the demand any less real. This realization didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it helped me understand it differently. I hadn't been targeted because I was weak or stupid or pathetic. I'd been targeted because I was successful, generous, and emotionally available. These weren't character flaws. They were strengths that had been weaponized against me. Understanding this distinction was the first step toward healing. I also realized that staying silent about what had happened wasn't protecting anyone except Siri, Robert, Thomas, Kevin, and who knows how many other men were still trapped in the web she'd woven, still writing checks and believing lies. By saying nothing, I was enabling her to continue victimizing others. The threats she'd made about destroying my reputation were real, but my obligation to prevent future harm was greater than my fear of personal consequences. The decision to expose her operation came during a sleepless night 3 weeks after our confrontation. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I imagined another man in my position. Some recent widower or divorcee, lonely and vulnerable, walking into Lotus Spa for the first time. Would I want someone to warn him about what he was walking into? Would I want him to have the information that could save him from months or years of manipulation? The answer was obvious. I called Janet the next morning and asked her to prepare a comprehensive report documenting Siri's operation. Then I contacted Robert, Thomas, and Kevin, using the information Janet had gathered to track them down. One by one, I shared what I'd learned and helped them understand the reality of their situations. The reactions varied. Robert was devastated but grateful. He'd given Siri over $80,000 over 18 months and had been planning to propose marriage. Thomas was angry, both at Siri and at me for shattering his illusions. He accused me of lying, of being jealous, of trying to sabotage his relationship out of spite. Kevin was philosophical. He'd suspected something was wrong for months, but hadn't wanted to face the truth. Learning about the other men actually came as a relief. Together, we decided to file a complaint with the state licensing board that regulated massage therapists. While Siri's romantic manipulations weren't illegal, her financial relationships with clients violated professional ethics rules. The complaint wouldn't result in criminal charges, but it might cost her the license that allowed her to operate, making it harder for her to find new victims. We also decided to share our story with local media outlets and online forums where other potential victims might see it, not to shame Siri publicly, but to educate people about the warning signs and tactics used in romance scams. If our humiliation could prevent others from falling into the same trap, then it served a purpose beyond our personal healing. The media response was overwhelming. Apparently, stories about romance scams involving massage therapists were rare enough to be newsworthy, but common enough to be relatable. Local news stations interviewed us. Newspaper reporters wrote feature stories, and online forums buzzed with similar tales from other victims. The response made it clear that what had happened to us was part of a much larger phenomenon. Siri's reaction to the publicity was swift and predictable. She disappeared from Seattle within a week of the first news story, leaving behind unpaid rent and a forwarding address that turned out to be fake. Her fiancé, Mike, claimed he'd known nothing about her other relationships and filed a police report claiming she'd stolen money from their joint accounts. Whether he was genuinely innocent or simply covering his tracks was impossible to determine. But the most surprising outcome was the number of other massage therapists who contacted us after hearing our story, not to defend Siri, but to thank us for exposing practices that gave their profession a bad reputation. Several of them shared stories about clients who'd approached them expecting inappropriate relationships, clearly having been conditioned by previous experiences with unethical practitioners. Our willingness to go public had apparently helped legitimate therapists by drawing attention to the difference between healing touch and manipulative touch. The healing process was slower and more complex than I'd expected. Even after I understood intellectually what had happened, my emotions took months to catch up. I found myself missing Siri, despite knowing she'd never really existed. I missed the version of her that had listened to my problems with apparent compassion, that had made me feel important and needed, that had transformed the loneliest period of my life into something bearable. Therapy helped, though it took me several tries to find a therapist who understood that being the victim of a con game wasn't the same as having relationship issues. Dr. Martinez specialized in helping people recover from various forms of fraud and manipulation. She helped me understand that my attachment to Siri had been real, even though Siri herself hadn't been. The emotions I'd felt, the connection I'd experienced, the joy of helping someone I cared about. These were all genuine human experiences that had value regardless of the circumstances that had created them. The fact that someone exploited your capacity for love and generosity doesn't invalidate those qualities. Dr. Martinez told me during one of our sessions, if anything, it proves how strong they are. Your ability to care deeply, to give freely, to open your heart despite the risk of being hurt. These are the things that make relationships possible. Don't let one person's abuse of your trust convince you to close yourself off from future connections. The road back to trusting others was long and difficult. I found myself analyzing every interaction for signs of manipulation, questioning every compliment for hidden motives, doubting every expression of interest or affection. Dating felt impossible when I couldn't distinguish between genuine attraction and calculated performance. How could I ever again believe that someone was interested in me rather than my bank account? But gradually, with help from therapy and support from friends who knew what had happened, I began to rebuild my capacity for connection, not by becoming more suspicious or cynical, but by becoming more grounded in my own worth. The experience with Siri had taught me that I was willing to pay almost any price to avoid loneliness, and that desperation had made me vulnerable to exploitation. Learning to be comfortable with solitude was the first step toward building healthy relationships with others. I also threw myself back into work with renewed focus, but this time with better boundaries. The compulsive workaholism that had contributed to my divorce and made me vulnerable to Siri's manipulation was replaced by a more balanced approach to professional success. I started taking actual vacations, pursuing hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage, reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the crisis period after my divorce. 6 months after the confrontation, I received an unexpected email from Siri. She was writing from Las Vegas, where she'd apparently established a new base of operations. The message was brief but revealing. She wanted to apologize for how things had ended between us, not because she felt guilty about what she'd done, but because the publicity had made it harder for her to work. She claimed that her feelings for me had been genuine, that I'd been different from her other clients, that she regretted the way circumstances had forced her to hurt me. Even knowing everything I knew about her methods and motivations, I felt a flutter of the old emotions when I read her words. The part of me that had fallen in love with her character wanted to believe that some small portion of what we'd shared had been real, but I'd learned enough about manipulation to recognize the message for what it was. Another attempt to control my emotions for her benefit. I deleted the email without responding and blocked her address to prevent future contact. The final chapter of this story began almost a year later when Kevin contacted me with unexpected news. He'd received a call from a detective in Las Vegas who was investigating Siri for identity theft and wire fraud. Apparently, Her operation had evolved beyond romance scams into more serious crimes. She'd been using fake identities to open bank accounts and had been wire transferring money to Thailand in amounts large enough to trigger federal investigations. The detective wanted to interview all of her known victims as part of building a case against her. It seemed that while our complaints about professional ethics violations hadn't been enough to stop her, her escalation into federal crimes had finally drawn the attention of law enforcement agencies with the resources and authority to act. I testified via video conference about my experiences with Siri, focusing on the financial transactions and the methods she'd used to gain my trust. It was strange to reduce such an emotionally complex experience to facts and dates and dollar amounts. But that's what the legal system required. The detective assured me that there were now at least 12 documented victims across 3 states and that the evidence against her was overwhelming. Siri was arrested 3 months later in Phoenix, where she'd been operating under a different name and targeting elderly widowers through a different method. Instead of working as a massage therapist, she'd been volunteering at senior centers and befriending lonely men who'd lost their wives. The basic playbook was the same, but the demographic was different, presumably because middle-aged divorced men had become too risky after the publicity surrounding our case. She was eventually convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The judge noted during sentencing that romance scams were among the most psychologically damaging forms of fraud because they exploited victims' fundamental need for human connection. The sentence was intended not just to punish Siri, but to deter others who might be tempted to profit from loneliness and heartbreak. Learning about her conviction provided a sense of closure that I hadn't expected to feel, not because I took pleasure in her punishment, but because it validated the reality of what had happened to me and the other men she targeted. We hadn't been foolish or weak or deserving of exploitation. We'd been victims of crimes committed by someone who had made a profession out of predatory manipulation. But the real healing came from the relationships I'd built in the aftermath of the experience. My friendship with Robert deepened into something genuinely supportive and meaningful. We met for coffee every few weeks to talk about our experiences, our recovery, and our gradual return to trusting others. Kevin joined us occasionally, and we formed an unlikely support group bound together by our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. I also started volunteering with a local organization that provided education about financial fraud targeting older adults. My experience with Siri had taught me valuable lessons about the psychology of scams and the warning signs that potential victims should watch for. Speaking to groups of seniors about romance scams was initially difficult because it required me to relive painful memories. But it became deeply rewarding when I saw the recognition in listeners' eyes. The moment when they realized they'd been heading towards similar situations. 2 years after the confrontation at Lotus Spa, I met Sarah at one of these educational seminars. She was a retired teacher who'd attended the presentation because her sister had been targeted by an online romance scammer. After the formal program ended, we talked for hours about manipulation, recovery, and the challenge of staying open to genuine connection while protecting ourselves from predators. Sarah became a friend first, then something more. But the progression was slow and cautious, built on a foundation of shared understanding rather than desperate need. She knew my story, understood my vulnerabilities, and appreciated the work I'd done to heal from the experience. I knew hers too, because she'd survived her own betrayals and had done her own work to rebuild her capacity for trust. Our relationship developed organically, without the artificial intensity that had characterized my connection with Siri. There were no manufactured crises requiring financial rescue, no urgent problems that only I could solve, no carefully crafted vulnerabilities designed to trigger my protective instincts. Instead, there was genuine compatibility, shared interests, and the kind of emotional intimacy that grows from mutual respect rather than calculated manipulation. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. With Siri, I'd felt constantly needed, but never truly known. With Sarah, I felt seen, understood, and valued for who I actually was, rather than what I could provide. The relationship was built on reciprocity rather than rescue, on companionship rather than crisis, on reality rather than fantasy. As I write this story today, 3 years have passed since I last saw Siri. She's still in federal prison, with another year left on her sentence. I don't think about her often anymore. And when I do, it's with something closer to pity than anger. She was skilled at what she did, but what she did was ultimately self-destructive. She'd chosen a path that required her to see other people as marks rather than human beings, to build her life on lies rather than genuine connection, to profit from pain rather than contribute to healing. The experience taught me that loneliness makes us vulnerable, but it also taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. The capacity to be hurt is the same capacity that allows us to be healed. The openness that made me susceptible to Siri's manipulation is the same openness that allowed me to build a genuine relationship with Sarah. The key wasn't to close myself off from connection, but to learn the difference between healthy vulnerability and desperate need. If I could go back and change what happened, would I? The easy answer is yes, of course. I would save myself months of pain, thousands of dollars, and a humiliating lesson in human nature. But the more complex truth is that the experience, as painful as it was, led me to a better understanding of myself, and ultimately to healthier relationships with others. I learned to recognize the warning signs of manipulation. I learned to distinguish between genuine care and calculated performance. I learned that real intimacy grows slowly and naturally, rather than being manufactured through crisis and rescue. Most importantly, I learned that my worth as a person isn't dependent on how much I can provide for others, or how desperately someone claims to need me. The story of my relationship with Siri is ultimately a story about the human need for connection and the lengths we'll go to find it. In a world where genuine intimacy is increasingly rare and difficult to achieve, there will always be people willing to sell counterfeit versions to those who are lonely enough to buy them. The solution isn't to stop seeking connection, but to build our capacity for discernment, to trust our instincts when something feels too good to be true, and to value ourselves enough to demand authenticity in our relationships. If you're watching this video because you recognize something of your own experience in my story, please know that you're not alone and you're not stupid. Romance scams succeed not because their victims are weak, but because human beings are wired to seek connection and meaning. The shame belongs to those who exploit these fundamental needs, not to those who fall victim to the exploitation. Recovery is possible, but it requires patience, support, and often professional help. Don't try to heal in isolation, and don't let one person's betrayal convince you that all relationships are dangerous. The goal isn't to become invulnerable, but to become more discriminating, more grounded in your own worth, and more aware of the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics. Most importantly, don't let the experience of being manipulated turn you into a manipulator. Don't let betrayal make you cynical about human nature or closed off to genuine connection. The world needs people who are willing to be generous, kind, and open-hearted. Just make sure you're giving these gifts to people who deserve them and who are capable of reciprocating them. Thank you for listening to my story. If it's helped you understand your own situation better, or given you hope that recovery is possible, then sharing it was worthwhile. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment about your own experiences or thoughts, and keep an eye out for future stories that explore the complex territory between love and exploitation. Remember, every story of betrayal is also a story of survival, and every survivor has the potential to help others avoid similar traps. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.